In July 1981, a 14-year-old girl named Stacy Arras vanished during a trip to Yosemite National Park and was never seen again. Stacy was visiting the park with her father and a group of other campers when she disappeared from the vicinity of Sunrise High Sierra Camp, a remote backcountry lodge area at 9,400 feet. Despite one of the most intensive search operations in Yosemite's history, no sign of Stacy, aside from a single small clue, was ever found. But let's back it up a moment, since the circumstances surrounding her disappearance are highly unusual. They were part of a group of about 10 people, including a guide or two, touring the park's High Sierra Camp Loop, a popular way for visitors to experience Yosemite's high country. On July 17, 1981, the party rode on mules from Tuolumne Meadows to the Sunrise High Sierra Camp, a cluster of cabins near several alpine lakes. They arrived at this camp around mid-afternoon, approximately 3 p.m., and dismounted their mules and set in to rest for the evening. Stacy and her father were assigned to share one of the simple cabins at the camp, and after arriving, she decided to freshen up. She took a quick shower and changed clothes, initially slipping on casual sandals as she relaxed from the day's ride. Not long after getting settled, Stacy told her father that she wanted to take her camera and walk a short distance to photograph one of the nearby lakes. The Sunrise High Sierra Camp sits close to a series of small backcountry lakes, and it was a clear summer afternoon. Simply put, it was a seemingly perfect opportunity for a few scenic pictures. Stacy invited her father to come along, but he was tired and declined. Instead, another member of their group, a 77-year-old man named Gerald Stewart, agreed to accompany her on the short hike. Before they set off, Stacy's father advised her to change out of her sandals and put on hiking boots, given the rough terrain on the trail. She did so, lacing up a pair of gray hiking boots as recommended. At around 4 p.m., by most accounts, Stacy, carrying her small Olympus camera, headed out on the trail toward the closest lake, with the elderly man walking beside her. The trail from the camp to the nearest lake is only about 1 mile. However, despite this, Stacy and old Mr. Stewart walked only part of that distance together. After a short way, the old man began to tire due to the uphill terrain and decided to stop and rest on a boulder along the trail. Despite old Mr. Stewart stopping, Stacy was still eager to reach a good vantage point by the water. She reportedly told him that she would walk ahead to find a nice spot by the lake and would return in just a few minutes. As Mr. Stewart sat down, one of the tour guides, who happened to be working near the camp's horse corral not far away, briefly spotted Stacy on her own. The guide later recounted seeing the teenage girl standing on a rock about 50 yards off the trail, looking out toward the lake, before she stepped out of view behind some trees. That was the last confirmed sighting of Stacy Arras. When Stacy didn't return promptly, the campers, including her dad, immediately raised an alarm. Within minutes, members of her group grew concerned and went searching for her along the path and around the lakeshore, but she was nowhere to be found. Initially, her father and others from the group searched the immediate area, calling out her name and checking the trail and lakeshore where she had headed. As evening approached with still no sign of Stacy, park staff at the High Sierra Camp also joined the effort, scouring the vicinity until nightfall. At first light the next morning, July 18, 1981, the National Park Service launched a full-scale search and rescue operation. Over the following days, this search would grow into one of the largest in Yosemite history. Dozens of park rangers, trained search and rescue personnel, and volunteers converged on the backcountry around Sunrise High Sierra Camp to look for the missing girl. Eventually, more than 100 people were involved at the peak of the hunt, aided by dog teams, professional mountain climbers, divers, and helicopter support. The park's helicopter alone flew over 40 hours during the operation, ferrying search teams and scanning the ground from above. Teams of divers were dispatched to search the nearby lakes in case Stacy had fallen into the water. Canine units were also brought in to track any scent or trail. Every resource available was thrown into the urgent effort to find the missing teen. One small clue did emerge during the search. About a day into the operation, searchers discovered a camera part on the ground, believed to belong to Stacy. Reports vary slightly, but multiple sources indicate that the lens cap of her camera was found near the tree line between the camp and the lake, in the area where she had last been seen. This suggested that she had indeed reached that vicinity, and something may have occurred there. Perhaps the cap popped off as she fell, or perhaps it fell off during some kind of struggle, but unfortunately the cap by itself didn't tell investigators much. Further, it's not clear to me from the evidence if this was ever confirmed, with absolute certainty, to be Stacy's lens cap. Beyond that single item, no other trace of Stacy Arras was ever recovered. As one Yosemite official put it at the time, quote, "She just seems to have disappeared from that spot." The formal search continued intensively for over a week. On the 9th day of intensive searching, with thousands of man-hours invested and still no sign of the girl, officials made the difficult decision to scale back the operation. The massive search was suspended after exhaustively covering the primary area of interest. In the absence of conclusive evidence, several theories have been proposed over the years to explain the disappearance of Stacy Arras. Investigators at the time kept an open mind, considering everything from an accident to foul play. The most straightforward theory is that Stacy was the victim of a misstep or accident in the wilderness. Yosemite's backcountry can be dangerous, especially for someone wandering alone off trail, even for a short distance. One possibility is that she might have slipped on the granite slabs or loose rocks near the lake and fallen into an unseen crevice or canyon. A search team member noted there were many places where a body could slip in or remain hidden in that area. If Stacy was injured from a fall, she may have tried to shelter herself, for instance, crawling under a rock overhang or into a hollow log to escape the cold night. Such concealment, while a natural instinct for survival, could have made her even harder to find. It's also possible she became disoriented while looking for the lake and wandered farther than intended, getting lost in the labyrinth of similar-looking terrain. Despite the thorough search, an accident scenario cannot be ruled out. The wilderness is vast, and even intensive searches have been known to miss clues or remains, especially if someone moved beyond the initial search grid. Related to the accident theory is the idea that Stacy might have drowned in the lake she set out for. Perhaps she reached the water's edge and, for reasons unknown, she fell into the lake and could not get out. However, this theory seems less likely given the search efforts. Rescue teams did deploy divers to thoroughly probe the lakes for any sign of her, but found absolutely nothing. Early on, park officials didn't dismiss the possibility of wild animal involvement, though they found no direct evidence for it. Yosemite is home to black bears and mountain lions, both of which could attack a human, especially a lone teenager. Some have speculated that perhaps a mountain lion, which can silently stalk prey, might have pounced on Stacy, dragged her away, and hidden her remains. However, there are several points against this. First, attacks on humans by predators in Yosemite are exceedingly rare. For instance, black bears in that park are generally interested in campers' food, not attacking people, and fatal mountain lion attacks in California are very uncommon. Second, a struggle with a large animal typically leaves signs: torn clothing, blood, tracks, or drag marks. The search teams did not report finding any such evidence. The only item found was the camera lens cap, which in itself showed no marks indicating an animal encounter. If a bear or cougar had taken Stacy, search dogs might have picked up the scent of an animal or blood, but the dogs detected nothing. The animal attack theory is considered theoretically possible, but extremely improbable given the balance of evidence. Another theory is that Stacy Arras could have been the victim of foul play, perhaps an abduction or slaying concealed in the wilderness. Investigators kept this theory on the table, and in fact, a park official stated that foul play has not been ruled out during the initial search. However, there are challenges to this idea. Stacy disappeared in a relatively short window of time, mere minutes, in broad daylight, with other people not far away. For a stranger to abduct her, that person would likely have had to be hiding out of sight near the lake, and then acted incredibly quickly and quietly. The area is remote, and there's no road access nearby for over 2 miles. Therefore, it would be difficult for a criminal to be lurking there and then transport a victim out of the area without being noticed by the search teams converging soon after. Further, the terrain required to get to a road is extremely difficult, making such an abduction very difficult. Nonetheless, it's not impossible that she encountered someone with ill intentions, perhaps a lone hiker, or even an employee or member of her group, and met with foul play. All members of Stacy's own travel group were presumably interviewed by authorities. There has never been any public indication that someone in the group was suspected, or that any evidence pointed to a specific individual. The elderly man who was with her, Gerald Stewart, was one of the last to see her, and naturally some armchair detectives have wondered if he could have harmed her. Personally, while I see why people are skeptical of him in this situation, all accounts report he was a fairly frail 77-year-old man. Search parties converged upon the area extremely rapidly, and I simply doubt that he had the ability to hide Stacy in rough terrain in the short window of time available. Further again, there's simply no trace of her whatsoever, beyond a small bit of her camera. Due to the baffling lack of evidence, Stacy Arras' case has often been labeled as unexplained. It's one of those disappearances that, even after exhaustive efforts, offers no clear answers. In particular, this is a case that has attracted attention from individuals such as David Paulides in his controversial Missing 411 series. And it's not hard to tell why a paranormal-focused theory has attached itself to this case, since the evidence we have simply doesn't add up to any rational likely answer. Whatever the truth is, the fact is that over 40 years after Stacy Arras' disappearance, we're no closer to that truth today than the investigators were on the day she disappeared. On November 15, 2017, Baltimore detective Sean Suter was found shot in the head while on duty, under circumstances that remain deeply mysterious. That afternoon, Sean and his partner were canvassing a West Baltimore neighborhood, searching for leads in an old case. At some point, Suter went to investigate a small alley off Bennett Place. Moments later, a series of shots rang out. Suter's partner sprinted over and discovered him lying face down in a vacant lot, critically wounded by the shots. A frantic call for backup went out, and soon police swarmed the area. Believing an armed suspect had just attacked an officer, the Baltimore Police Department locked down the surrounding blocks. For nearly a week, officers maintained a tight cordon around the Harlem Park neighborhood, questioning residents and hunting for a suspect who, it seemed, had vanished without a trace. Despite this massive response, no eyewitnesses or leads emerged in the immediate aftermath. The detective was rushed to the hospital but succumbed to his injury the next day. City officials initially eulogized him as a hero killed in the line of duty. The mystery deepened when it was revealed that Sean was scheduled to testify before a federal grand jury the very next day. This was in a case related to a notorious police unit that had essentially gone rogue. Basically, think The Shield meets The Wire, for all my fans of cop shows out there. Suter was slated to be a witness, answering questions about an incident involving one of the indicted officers. The timing of his death on the eve of that testimony was more than a coincidence in the eyes of many. As the investigation pressed on, detectives uncovered puzzling forensic evidence at the scene. Suter's own service weapon was found beneath his body, and ballistics confirmed that the bullet came from that weapon. In total, 3 spent shell casings were recovered, all fired from Sean's weapon. There was no indication that any other weapon was used. Crucially, forensic technicians found no DNA or fingerprints from any unknown person on Sean's weapon or clothing. The autopsy noted a close contact wound just behind Sean's right ear and no obvious signs of a struggle, such as defensive wounds on his hands. These findings didn't align neatly with the theory of a sudden attack by a suspect. By late 2017, with no suspects and growing doubts, the Baltimore Police Department brought in an independent review board of outside experts to take a fresh look. In 2018, this independent panel released a detailed report that came to a startling and extremely controversial conclusion, which angered the family and many on the police force. It determined Sean likely orchestrated the entire thing, ending himself and essentially staging the entire scene. The panel theorized that Suter, distraught over the looming grand jury testimony, fired 2 shots in the air or into the ground to simulate a shootout, then ended himself with his service weapon. They pointed to the evidence as support: the contact wound, the angle of the shot, the absence of any other DNA, and the fact that Sean's police radio was still in his hand when he was found. According to the review board, Sean might have been driven by fear that his testimony could expose him to serious fallout, which could have placed his career in jeopardy, or worse. They believed he wanted to ensure his family would receive full benefits by making his demise appear to have taken place both heroically and in the line of duty. The panel's conclusion was immediately disputed by Sean's family, as well as numerous voices in the police department itself, ensuring the debate was far from over. In the years since, several theories have been debated regarding Sean Suter's death. The original police theory was that there was a battle with an unknown assailant who fled the scene. However, despite an intense manhunt, no suspect was ever found. Furthermore, no evidence of any other person was uncovered at the scene, making this scenario increasingly doubtful. Another theory posits that Sean was deliberately slain to stop him from testifying. His family strongly believes in and advocated for this inside job scenario, insisting that he had no reason to do this to himself. They point to the suspicious timing of the event, but to date, no concrete evidence has emerged to prove an organized plot or identify any conspirators. But of course, the problem with this quote-unquote debunking of the theory is that the same people who were investigating his death may have contained elements involved in his demise. At least that's the case if the inside scenario is true. Further, even if the inside job scenario is true, advocates argue even minor actions during the early hours of the investigation could have essentially stopped the truth from ever coming out. To this day, the death of Sean Suter remains officially unsolved and intensely debated. Importantly, it was an independent body who found that he was responsible for his own demise, not the police themselves. Baltimore's law enforcement agencies themselves ended up split on the outcome. That said, after the independent panel's report, the police department moved to close the case in 2019, effectively treating it as a tragedy rather than a criminal event. Nevertheless, the Baltimore state's attorney at the time disagreed with closing the case, pointing out that the medical examiner's ruling still stood. As a result, the case has technically stayed open, and key evidence files have not been released publicly, meaning that this case is riddled with unknowns. Suter's widow and family have never accepted the conclusion of the independent body. They received a $900,000 line-of-duty benefit settlement in 2020, which they viewed as confirmation that he did indeed go out in combat with a criminal. The family has continued to call for the investigation to identify whoever might have been responsible, though they appear to have made little meaningful headway despite their efforts. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here with a quick reminder for you to share this video with 2 of your friends. Now let's get back to business. Airi Sato was a 22-year-old Japanese college student originally from Hokkaido who had moved to Tokyo to pursue her studies and a budding career as a live streamer. On Tuesday morning, March 11th, 2025, Airi Sato decided to stream her walk through the streets of Tokyo using a popular streaming app. She often streamed under the handle Mogami Ai, engaging with thousands of followers in real time. Around 9:50 a.m., as Sato walked alone near the busy Takadanobaba train station in Shinjuku Ward, viewers suddenly heard her scream for help before the live stream abruptly went dark. Several onlookers in the area also heard the chilling screams, which one witness said lasted about 15 seconds. Startled pedestrians rushed to see what was happening and found Sato collapsed on the sidewalk, bleeding profusely, with a man standing over her. At first, bystanders assumed the man was a concerned Good Samaritan because he appeared unnervingly calm as he looked down at the wounded young woman, as if he was in shock. That perception changed when they noticed he was holding a bloody knife. It became clear that this man was not helping Sato, but rather that he was attacking her. Emergency calls brought police officers to the location within minutes. The suspect offered no resistance and was arrested on the spot. Officers confiscated 2 survival-style hunting knives from him, one of which had a 5-inch blade, and the other which was slightly shorter. A gravely injured Airi Sato was hurried to a nearby hospital, but despite doctors' efforts, she was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. In the span of moments, a young woman's life had been brutally cut short on a public street in broad daylight, all while some of her fans helplessly watched the horror unfold live online. In the immediate aftermath, investigators worked to identify both the victim and the perpetrator and to understand what led to this heinous act. The attacker taken into custody at the scene was soon identified as Kenichi Takano, a 42-year-old man from Oyama City in Tochigi Prefecture. He was transferred to Tokyo's prosecutors on March 13, 2025, to face formal first-degree charges, as police pieced together evidence suggesting that the attack was premeditated. As the investigation progressed, a disturbing history between Takano and Airi Sato came to light. Far from being a random stranger, Takano was in fact an avid follower of Sato's live streams and had been acquainted with her for several years online. Police and media reports revealed that the two first became familiar around late 2021, when Takano began watching Sato's videos and interacting with her as a fan. By mid-2022, Takano's interest in the young streamer had escalated beyond the virtual realm. Around August 2022, he started going to a restaurant in Tokyo where Sato worked part-time, hoping to see her in person. During this period, Sato confided in Takano, as she did with some loyal fans, that she was struggling financially with living expenses. Takano responded by lending her money repeatedly over the following months, ultimately giving her large sums to help cover her rent and other costs. According to investigative sources, Takano provided Sato with over 2 million yen, approximately $13,000, across about 13 installments between September and December 2022. However, by early 2023, their relationship had soured. Sato had repaid only a small fraction of the loans and then abruptly cut off contact with Takano around January 2023. Feeling spurned and owed a great deal of money, Takano pursued legal action. In August 2023, he filed a civil lawsuit against Sato, to reclaim the approximately 2.5 million yen debt. Sato did not appear in court to defend herself, and the court ruled in Takano's favor, ordering her to repay the full amount. Yet even with a court judgment, Takano found it impossible to collect the money. Sato seemingly disappeared or ignored the order. In January 2024, Takano went so far as to consult local police to file a false missing persons report in an attempt to get the police to hunt her down on his behalf. By the time of the March 2025 live stream, Takano's frustration and anger appear to have reached a boiling point. In statements to police after his arrest, he admitted that his motive was rooted in this long-running financial dispute. He said he could not stand that Sato continued earning money through her live videos while refusing to repay him. On the morning of March 11th, after seeing Sato announce a live streaming session, Takano left his home in Oyama and took a train into the city. As Sato began streaming in Shinjuku that morning, Takano was already tracking her. He later explained that he identified her exact location by watching the live stream video in real time, recognizing the buildings and landmarks in the background. Armed with this information, he approached her on the street during the live broadcast and launched the knife attack without saying a word. Despite the ferocity of the assault, Takano claimed afterwards that he, quote, did not intend to end her. This assertion rang hollow, given the sheer violence inflicted. In fact, his actions and statements suggest a calculated plan to quote-unquote punish Sato and expose her perceived wrongdoing to the world. Takano reportedly told investigators that he wanted the world to know what Sato had done to him, and thought that causing an incident would expose her. The police have indicated that Takano has been cooperative and consistent in explaining his actions, and a psychiatric evaluation found him mentally competent. As of late March 2025, Kenichi Takano remains in custody, facing numerous charges, and the legal case against him is progressing through the Japanese justice system. But trust me, there's way more twists and turns to this story than you can imagine. News of Airi Sato's death and the ensuing revelations about the suspect's motive gripped the public and sparked extensive discussion on social media and in true crime forums. The case was unusual. It combined the worlds of online influencers, devoted fans, and real-life violence. In the days following the tragedy, as facts trickled out via news reports, multiple theories and debates emerged about what really happened between Sato and Takano. Initially, many observers assumed the incident was a stark example of a stalker fan obsession taken to the extreme. It's not uncommon for popular live streamers in Japan to attract intensely devoted followers, and sadly there have been prior cases of stalkers attacking public figures. This of course changed when the financial motive was publicly disclosed by the authorities. But just as soon as this case looked as though it had been wrapped up in a neat package, a major twist occurred. A man claiming to be Airi Sato's fiancé suddenly stepped forward online. Just days after the event, an account on X was created by someone who identified himself as Sato's fiancé and live-in partner. The man, later identified as 32-year-old Daikon Yu, who described himself as the CEO of a company, made a series of posts that added new layers to the story. In his posts, Yu stated, "Mogami Ai was living with me and was my fiancé," and even shared photos and videos of himself with Sato to prove their relationship. This revelation surprised many who had followed the case, as Sato had never publicly mentioned being engaged. According to Yu's detailed account, he and Sato had begun dating in mid-2023 and started living together that August, at which point they became engaged. He claimed that he too had lent Sato significant sums of money to support her, and he corroborated that Sato had ongoing money troubles with multiple people, including Takano. Crucially, Yu shed light on Sato's interactions with Takano from an insider's perspective, and it painted a very different picture from what Takano stated. Takano had put forward a narrative where he was a person who was pushed to the extremes by someone who ignored a court order to repay him. You, on the other hand, alleged that Takano had been persistently harassing Sato. He was showing up at her workplace, pressuring her for a romantic relationship, and stalking her online. All these events led her to the point that Sato had to pause her live streaming activities in early 2023 out of fear, and in essence go into hiding. This is a markedly different version of events than Takano has told, where she disappeared essentially to avoid debts. In one post, you wrote that the suspect's goal was not merely to recoup money, rather he felt that he had purchased the right to have a relationship with her with his loans and gifts. This strongly suggests that Takano may have been motivated by unrequited feelings and a sense of betrayal, in addition to the unpaid debt. You further claimed that Sato had told him nothing improper had happened between her and Takano, but that she had told him a number of personal secrets. You claimed that Sato was fearful of him exposing these secrets, which you, of course, didn't divulge. Notably, despite the horrible and unjustifiable nature of the attacks, some Japanese commentators, according to my automatic translations, appear to justify what happened. They suggest that she knew exactly what she was getting into when she interacted with Takano and accepted the loans from him. Notably, these commenters seem to make it appear as though Sato had deceived her fans by making herself appear to be single when she was not. The slaying of Airi Sato is a clear example of a parasocial relationship turning deadly. Live streamers often underestimate how deeply viewers can become emotionally invested, creating a false sense of intimacy that can have dangerous consequences. Sato's interactions with Kenichi Takano, which included personal disclosures and financial exchanges, blurred critical boundaries. Takano developed unrealistic expectations of closeness, leading to resentment when those expectations were unmet. This resentment eventually escalated into violent retaliation. Live streaming inherently encourages direct engagement between creators and their audiences, making it easy for some fans to misinterpret these interactions as genuine relationships. Sato's openness about her financial struggles, along with her acceptance of significant loans from Takano, unintentionally reinforced his belief that they shared a close personal connection. When Sato cut ties, Takano perceived this as betrayal, fueling his anger and sense of entitlement. This is further complicated based on Yu's subsequent disclosures, as it looks like she may have had to cut ties because these loans weren't actually loans, but instruments of control. But let's get back to the problems inherent in live streaming and parasociality. The real-time nature of live streaming creates vulnerabilities that many creators overlook. By publicly sharing her location during streams, Sato inadvertently allowed Takano to track her, ultimately facilitating his attack. This incident highlights how easily online interactions can lead to real-world harm, especially when boundaries are unclear or neglected. Further, it's unclear how many times he had used these live streams to stalk Sato. Notably, Yu had said that Sato had previously found Takano so bizarre that she needed to stop live streaming for a period of time. However, this creates the inevitable problem when this is either her primary source of income or one of her primary sources of income. The slaying has sparked global conversations about the responsibilities of live streamers regarding their safety and interactions with fans. Some emphasize the necessity for clear boundaries and awareness about the potential dangers posed by overly involved viewers. As further details of this case emerge in the coming months, I'm hoping to have updates for everyone, so stay tuned. That said, I imagine the depravity of Kenichi Takano may go much further than he was initially willing to admit. Cambyses II was the second ruler of the Achaemenid Persian Empire and the eldest son of the famous conqueror Cyrus the Great. He ascended the throne around 530 BC and, much like his father, pursued aggressive military expansion. His most notable campaign was the conquest of Egypt in 525 BC, defeating Pharaoh Psamtik III at the Battle of Pelusium and bringing the ancient land of the Nile under Persian rule. As the new ruler of Egypt, Cambyses II also took on the title of pharaoh. But his ambitions didn't stop at the Nile. While in Egypt, he planned further campaigns to Ethiopia and Carthage. However, neither of these plans materialized. However, most importantly for this story, he also sought to conquer the Siwa oasis in the western desert. The Oracle of Amun at the Siwa oasis was famous in the ancient world. Even Alexander the Great would later visit it. According to historical accounts, Cambyses II was angered or threatened by this oracle. In 524 BC, after capturing Egypt, he dispatched a detachment of about 50,000 Persian soldiers into the western desert, with orders to march on Siwa Oasis. This was essentially a punitive expedition against the priests of Amun, who were viewed as being unfavorable to Persian rule. Somewhere along the way, they vanished. Herodotus, the Greek historian, wrote that the force made it as far as the oasis of Karga, about halfway to Siwa, then met a terrible fate. In Cambyses' lifetime, no trace of the detachment was ever found. It simply never arrived at Siwa nor ever returned. This shocking disappearance of an entire army in the desert became a lingering worry for Cambyses II, who himself died a few years later under murky circumstances. Ancient writers like Herodotus provide the only detailed account of the lost army, and his dramatic story has captivated imaginations for well over 2 millennia. According to Herodotus's 5th century BC narrative, the Persian troops were swallowed by the desert, simply engulfed by a sudden sandstorm that buried all 50,000 men alive. Ever since, this tale has persisted as one of antiquity's greatest mysteries. How could an entire army simply vanish without a trace? The story has a tantalizing mix of elements: an ambitious king, a cursed mission against a sacred oracle, and the deadly forces of nature in the Sahara. The lost army remained a historical artifact that wasn't seriously investigated until the 19th century. Since then, its existence remains an archaeological holy grail, a puzzle that could confirm or refute an ancient historical account. Part of what keeps the mystery alive is the sheer scale of the event and the lack of concrete evidence. 50,000 men, if that number is accurate, would leave behind a lot of bones, weapons, and artifacts. Yet no definitive discovery has ever been confirmed. This absence of evidence has led many scholars to question the story. Some Egyptologists suspect the tale may be exaggerated or even fully apocryphal. Over the years, historians and scientists have proposed several explanations for what really happened to Cambyses' army, if it existed at all. The traditional explanation is the one given by Herodotus, a natural disaster. In this view, the army was simply overcome by the harsh desert environment. A sudden sandstorm, not uncommon in the Sahara, could indeed be deadly. Fierce desert winds can create a wall of sand type effect that could disorient anyone caught in the open. If such a storm lasted long enough, it might bury bodies and equipment in sand, erasing visible traces. Some scholars find this plausible, noting that the western desert's Great Sand Sea is known for massive dunes and extreme weather. However, others point out that it's unlikely for a sandstorm alone to eliminate every last man. If the story were true, some survivors would have presumably straggled out. It's also possible the soldiers succumbed to a combination of factors: extreme heat, thirst, and disorientation in the uncharted desert. Losing their way, they might have perished from dehydration and exposure, with the desert winds gradually covering their remains over time. Another popular theory, briefly touched upon earlier, is that the story was a myth or misreported history. Skeptics note that Herodotus wrote his account decades after the event and got his information secondhand, supposedly from Egyptian sources in Siwa. It's conceivable that no Persian army was actually lost in a sandstorm as described. Instead, the truth might have been less spectacular. For instance, the force could have been turned back by a sandstorm, and later generations turned it into a legend of divine punishment by the gods of the desert. Some historians argue that Herodotus, who loved a good tale to put it mildly, may have embellished the story in the extreme. After all, it seems highly unlikely that the Persians would have dispatched an extremely large force to conquer this oasis. First of all, it was a relatively small population center to begin with, and 50,000 men would have been an unreasonable allocation of resources. To put this in perspective, today the Siwa oasis only has a population of 25,000 people. But perhaps most importantly is the issue of supplying 50,000 troops on a march through the eastern Sahara Desert. This would be an extremely difficult task in modern times, with modern logistics, let alone in ancient times. If this lost army was based on a real event, it seems like the number may have been exaggerated by as much as 1 or even 2 orders of magnitude. The lack of corroborating records in Persian or Egyptian about this mass death is extremely suspicious as well. If Cambyses truly lost such a large part of his army, one might expect Persian chronicles or Egyptian inscriptions to mention it, yet we have none. Notably, some modern historians suspect that the lost army may have been a myth conjured up by the Persians themselves to cover up for a loss in battle. There's some evidence that Egyptian loyalists under Petubastis III scored a significant victory against the Persians around the time when the Lost Army event supposedly occurred. In favor of this, Petubastis III seized the moment to retake parts of Egypt, even crowning himself pharaoh in Memphis before the Persians could respond. 2 years later, Cambyses' successor Darius I reconquered the area and crushed the rebellion. Adventurers and archaeologists have mounted expeditions into the Egyptian desert specifically to find traces of the Persian force. In the 1930s, numerous European expeditions attempted to find any hint of the army, but turned up empty-handed. In the 1980s, more systematic searches were conducted using aircraft and basic ground-penetrating radar. Notably, some suspicious bone fragments were discovered, but they were later dated to 1500 BC, ruling them out. In recent years, modern satellite imagery and remote sensing have been applied in hopes of spotting unusual shapes under the sand, but nothing conclusive has surfaced as yet. Despite all efforts, no unequivocal physical evidence of Cambyses' 50,000 soldiers has ever been verified, and whether the story itself is true or not remains a mystery.